Thank you for joining Wars of the Rosies as we continue with Part 6, 18th-Century Masonic Revivals of Ancient Mysteries of Masonic Orders of Fraternity by Manly P. Hall. 18th-Century Masonic Revivals of Ancient Mysteries. At the precise time the mysterious Comte de Saint-Germain was traveling about Europe as an agent of the Knights Templars, a number of Kabbalistic, philosophic, and mystic systems of degrees and rites emerged to confuse the historians of the Masonic descent, like the manuscript Livre Trinosopai, traditionally attributed to Saint Germain, and other fragments associated with Comte's secret meetings of the estate of Landgrave of Hesse-Kassel. Many of these strange rituals were patterned upon the Greek and Egyptian mysteries. Some were directly inspired by the heresy of the Manes. Even while strange rites were developing within Freemasonry itself, independent enterprises came into existence outside the order, and several of these sought refuge under the broad wing of Masonry when trouble threatened. The clandestine lodges went so far in some cases as to attempt the complete domination of continental Masonry. In the confusion that resulted, many useful landmarks were obliterated and much valuable information was lost. The common denominator of the pseudo-esoteric societies was elaborate ritualism. The frenzied dilettante were initiated by fantastic rites into bizarre orders that promised much, collected high fees, and bestowed nothing. It was a day of dupes and disappointments, of large promises and small fulfillments. In addition to its Masonic interest, Europe was still dominated by the Hermetic speculations which had intrigued the minds of the 17th century intelligentsia. To a degree, Freemasonry was regarded as a conglomerate of older societies and the heir to their secret operations and public projects. The condition in Germany was typical. Secret societies of all kinds, religious, philosophical, political, and social, abounded. Most of these organizations were short-lived and of limited membership, but the atmosphere of mystery that surrounded each was pregnant with consequences. The lack of political unity among the German states was partly responsible for the conspiracies originating in the closed lodge rooms of some of these fraternities. From a Masonic Friendship album, the autograph and Rosicrucian ciphers of Bacon von Ecker und Eckhofen the Elder. A fraudulent Rosicrucian group that flourished for a time in Italy presented a strange cord to each of its initiates, with the solemn injunction that the frater was to use this cord upon himself rather than reveal the priceless secrets of the lodge. It was unlikely that any member was driven to this extremity, as he could take all the degrees without discovering anything worth concealing or revealing. All he had to show for his original investment was an elaborate parchment covered with Kabbalistic designs and illegible signatures. Robert Ecker und Eckenhofen the Elder was among those imposed upon by pseudo-Rosicrucian orders, doing a flourishing business in fees and special expenses. The Baron, a sincere and lovable intellectual, was lured on by frequent promises that the higher grades would reveal all. He ascended to the top of the ritualistic ladder, only to find that it ended in empty space. The society with which the good Baron was affiliated had many branches in many European cities and claimed a worldwide sphere of influence. He took his disillusionment seriously, and under the pseudonym Magistrate Bianco, wrote a scathing expo in High German titled The Rosicrucian in His Nakedness. Magistrate Bianco complained that he and thousands of others seeking wisdom had been subjected to the vilest possible impostors. The Baron was profoundly confused. There was so much of beauty in the old symbols, so much of legendary and lore derived from the ancient authorities, and so many solemn and majestic rituals that it seemed impossible that all could be false. Somewhere the true wisdom of antiquity must have been preserved. There was nothing to do but to seek further, so the Baron continued his quest, the result of which unhappily has not been recorded. Most of these spurious groups followed a general pattern. A few distinguished patrons, selected from the aristocracy and the sciences, were induced to lend the prestige of their names and stations. A genteel membership was then quietly solicited, limited by an exorbitant fee of initiation to those in prosperous circumstances. Most of the victims were too chagrined to publicize their own stupidity by exposing the frauds of which they had been the dupes. And, of course, they could not reveal the true state of affairs without compromising illustrious and respected persons. So the disillusioned ex-members nursed their grievances in private or, still hopeful of better fortune, cast their lot with other cults making attractive pretensions. The prestige and wealth accumulated by secret societies have sometimes been used as political weapons. This often happened even without the knowledge or consent of the membership. Groups, supposedly seeking only universal wisdom, conspired against the state, unseated rulers, and went so far as to sponsor anarchy. A network of private agencies thus came into existence, which could be used according to the tempers of leaders whose true motives were unknown or uncertain. Literally, hundreds of these independent movements, all claiming an ancient and honorable history, converged upon the Masonic Grand Lodges at a time when Masonry was struggling to clarify its own position. Secret organizations of one kind or another were both expedient and fashionable. Almost any subject suitable for group discussion, from chemistry to cosmic consciousness and from legal reform to literary criticism, required a mystic order or an esoteric reading circle for its very existence. Well-intentioned intellectuals could not gather to discuss Boethius, Bema, or Bacon without the paraphernalia of red plush curtains, high altars, secret grips, and mystic passwords. Humorous works appeared ridiculing this fashion. One of these explained how the members of a dining circle had to pass through an elaborate series of contortions, including darkened chambers and fiery ordeals, in order to assemble for a quiet dinner of potted chicken. A Masonic Congress was convened at Wilhelmsbad in 1782 under the presidency of the Duke of Brunswick to end the discord among the various groups of German Freemasons and related orders. This conference examined the records of several Grand Lodges which claimed to possess the secrets of the higher degrees of Freemasonry. These secrets were not discovered, but the controversial issue as to whether Masonry was to be considered a continuation of the orders of the Knights Templar was decided by a negative vote after 30 sittings. In the last quarter of the 18th century, the public mind, more and more disillusioned in its quest for mystic lore, turned its attention to the pressing problems of social reform and representative government. Esoteric orders with interest beyond the eminent continued to exist, but were reserved for the edification of small groups of thoughtful scholars, and these made little effort to attract public attention. Freemasonry, integrating its internal structure, gathered the remnants and records of the earlier exuberations, pronounced the irregular rites to be extinct, and retired the magnificent vellum charges as literary curiosities. Space permits only a brief survey of this remarkable restoration of pagan esoteric doctrines. The situation was partly due to increasing skepticism among intellectuals, which resulted from the broadening sphere of scientific influence, and partly from the deepening conviction that the clergy was in conspiracy with the aristocracy to perpetuate the serfdom of the masses. One expression of the general discontent was an effort to restore the mystic system as a means for accomplishing educational reform. The lack of esoteric content in the orthodox degrees of 18th century Freemasonry also supplied incentive to enrich the mystical overtones of the accepted symbols and ceremonies. The Rite of Perfection, or the Rite of Heirdom, was established by the Chevalier de Bonneville in the College of Jesuits of Clermont in Paris in 1754. The College of Clermont was the asylum of those adhering to the party of Stuart, and therefore the rite is said to have been strongly colored by the political prejudices and peculiarities of the Stuart cause. The Rite of Perfection consisted of 25 degrees, which may be recognized as the same as those of the Council of Empires of the East and West. These degrees, so far as they go, reappear in the ancient and accepted Scottish Rite. General Pike tells us that this rite succeeded the Council of Empires and inherited the principal distinguishing concept which dominated the Rite of Perfection. This concept, which also passed into the Rite of Strict Observation, held that Freemasonry was derived from Templarism and that consequently every Freemason was a Knight Templar. Standard Masonic historians enlarge upon this theme to the average reader's satisfaction. Martinez de Pasquale was a man of considerable learning who had traveled widely in the Near East, having visited Turkey, Arabia, and Palestine. He founded the Rite of Elected Cohens in 1754. After his death, a number of his papers and manuscripts descended rather curiously and were examined by Dr. Gerard Uncos, or Pappas, in 1895. Pasquale believed in the inspiration of the scriptures, the downfall of the angels, the theory of original sin, and the doctrine of justification by faith. He held that man existed in an elementary state long before the creation detailed in Genesis, and was gradually evolving into his present form. Louis Claude de Saint Martin, 1743 through 1803, French mystic and ritualist, was known as Le Philosophe Inconnu, and his works were published under this pseudonym. Saint Martin came from a family of wealth and gentle breeding. His mother died when he was a small child, but he had a most generous and indulgent stepmother. He was educated in law at the College of Pontoise. Though physically frail and given to mental pursuits, he decided to change his career and selected the profession of soldiering. Before entering the army, he became a Freemason, and even as a young man, was devoted to the study of religious philosophy. While his regiment was stationed at Bordeaux, he contacted the new system of Masonic rites, which had been introduced by Martins de Pasquale. Saint Martin was initiated into the elective priesthood in 1768 and amplified his learning by an intensive reading in Swedenborg. In 1771, he resigned from the army to become a teacher and leader in the field of mysticism. He traveled considerably, and his ideas was received with enthusiasm. It is to Martins de Pasquale, says Saint Martin, that I owe my introduction to the higher truth. The elected priesthood then consisted of 7 grades, of which the 7th was a grade of Rose Crooks. No details of the working of this grade appear to have survived. Ceremonial magic may have been included in the work of Pasquale, and there are references to the teachings of Bema and the spiritualistic productions of Dr. John Dee. Apparently, psychic phenomena were included in the early Martinist movement. Although St. Martin had been raised a strict Catholic and always remained sympathetic to the Church, his first work, Of Errors and Truth, was placed on the Index. St. Martin's ideal society was a natural and spiritual theocracy, in which God would raise up men of mark who would regard themselves strictly as divine commissioners to guide the people. The writings of St. Martin were brought to the consideration of Voltaire. In 1787, St. Martin went to Italy with Prince Golstein, then journeyed to Strasbourg. where he further studied the writings of Bema, translating parts of them into French. Back in Paris, he was arrested during the Revolution simply because he was a gentleman by birth. His affiliations with the Freemasons saved him from the Reign of Terror. He visited London, where he remained for several months, made the acquaintance of the astronomer Herschel, and contacted the writings of William Law, the great interpreter of Bema. St. Martin never married, but had a wide circle of friends and admirers, including many of the leaders of the intellectual world. The central concept of St. Martin's mystical philosophy is that man remains divine in spite of the fall reported in the scriptures. Within the human being lies dormant a high spiritual quality of which man is not always conscious, and which he must develop or release by freeing himself from the illusion of materialism. St. Martin died suddenly, presumably of a stroke while at prayer. There is considerable doubt as to the place of Baron Emanuel Swedenborg, 1688 to 1772, in the direct stream of Masonic descent. Samuel Beeswick affirmed that the Baron, when about 18 years of age, was initiated for the first time into the mysteries of Freemasonry at Lund, the capital of Skåne, the most southern province of Sweden. Later, he joined or affiliated with the Stockholm chapter. Beeswick noted that it was not uncommon to accept minors into the lodge at that time, given the example that George Washington was initiated before attaining his majority. It has been pointed out in the same work that the French scientist de Lalande invited to Swedenborg to visit the Lodge of the Nine Sisters in Paris, and that the Baron was present at the time once while de Lalande was worshipful master. From the Mirror of Maestais, London, 1616. The Court of the Muses. The Nine Sisters and a 10th figure representing Apollo are in attendance upon a throned and sceptered ruler, the personification of harmony and wit. Pegasus, standing upon the Parnassian hill, brings forth with the stroke of his hoof the streams of art and sacred skill. In the Thespian spring, 32 swans, poets or pens, sing their sad epodes. Compare this seal of Bacon's literary society with the plate of Apollo on Parnassus. Orders of the Quest, page 48. Most Masonic historians doubt that Swedenborg was even regularly initiated, but there is evidence in his writings that he was aware of the principal symbols used in Masonry, and Freemasons of the higher degrees certainly gathered inspiration and comfort from his mystical philosophy. The Abbé Pernetti, 1716 through 1800, has been given credit for the integration of Swedenborg's abstract speculations into what has been called a Theosophical Masonic system. Among those influenced by Swedenborg's elaborate extrasensory researches must be included Cagliostro, Mesmer, St. Martin, and Zinadorf. The unsavory Abbé Barreau claimed that he associated intimately with the members of the Theosophical Illuminati at Wilhelmsbad. He said that all these brethren were originally all Swedenborgians, and were at first distinct from the followers or adepts of Weishaupt. Later, they fraternized intimately. The Swedenborgian Rite seems to have opened its first lodge in Stockholm between 1750 and 1755. For reasons of safety or secrecy, no exact records were kept. Another lodge was later opened in Berlin under the auspices of the King of Persia, at the suggestion of Prince Charles. Swedenborg sent 2 copies of his Apocalypsis Revelata to Cardinal Prince de Rohan in 1766, and 3 years later, when the Baron was in Paris, Prince de Rohan visited him. The Cardinal was a Mason, for he was one of the signers of the patent given to Stephen Morin appointed him Inspector General of the Lodges, etc., in all parts of the New World. It is significant that Voltaire should devote time and research to defending the Manichaeans from the early attacks of St. Augustine. Fortunatus publicly challenged St. Augustine, as one who had assisted in the rituals of the sect, to declare openly and before the whole population as to whether any part of the Manichaean worship was impure or obscene. St. Augustine evaded the issue and tried to shift the argument from morals to death. At last, however, pressed by Fortunatus, he said grudgingly, "I acknowledge that in the prayer at which I assisted, I did not see you commit anything impure." The learned M. de Beausorbry shrewdly observed that it would be impossible to reconcile the saint's misgivings with the simple fact that Augustine himself remained for years a devotee of the Manichaean sect without, apparently, coming upon anything in their practices which offended his morals. Voltaire enlarged this discussion with many choice quotations and observations, and by his attitude aligned himself with the revival of the philosophy of Manes, which was behind and beneath most of the political and ethical secret societies of 18th century Europe. Voltaire was initiated into Freemasonry the year of his death. He became a member of the Lodge of the Nine Sisters, Muses, at Paris, the 7th day of February 1778. This lodge was remarkable, both for the quality of its initiates and for its direct influence upon developments of the great work in the Western Hemisphere. Voltaire died May 30th, 1778, and a lodge of sorrow was held in his memory on the 28th of November of the same year. His heart was removed from the body at the time of embalming and preserved in a silver case. Nearly 70 years after his death, the sarcophagus in the Pantheon was opened so that the heart could be placed with the rest of the remains, but the tomb was found to be empty. The initiation of Voltaire into the Masonic Order only a few months before he deceased is in startling contrast to the legend of his final reconciliation with the Church. Legends circulated at the time that he died repenting his impiety appear to have been inventions of his enemies. His last words were a request, rather petulantly stated, that he be left alone to die in peace. Voltaire was well acquainted with the esoteric teachings of the mysteries and was deeply involved in the processes of social reformation then operating in France. In 1839, a French Mason, Brother E.J. Marconis de Negras, instituted the Rite of Memphis, which Ragon believed to have been inspired by the extinct Rite of Mizra. The new rite, which worked 90 or more degrees, was not acknowledged among the systems acceptable to the Grand Orient of France until 1862. To accomplish this favorable relationship with the French Grand Orient, Marconis, who was then the Grand Hierophant, was obliged to divest himself of all authority over the rite and to accept complete obedience to the Grand Orient of France. This august body retired all the higher degrees as Masonic curiosities, and the initiates of the rite were not permitted to claim any higher degree than that of Master Mason. According to Marconius, the Rite of Memphis was brought to Europe by Ormuz, an Egyptian priest and sage of Alexandria, who was converted by Saint Mark in 46 AD, and who purified the Egyptian doctrine according to Christian principles. Manes was also involved, and the stand taken by Marconis was the same as that presented in the Order of the Quest. The Adept tradition was preserved by the followers of Ormuz until the year 1150 AD, when 81 of the initiates went to Sweden, presented themselves to the Archbishop of Usal, explained their Masonic doctrines to him, and established Masonry in Europe. The leader of these knights was Garamond, apparently a corruption of Garamond, the mysterious Patriarch of Jerusalem, before whom the Hospitallers are said to have taken their vows of obedience, chastity, and poverty. The legend of the 81 Masons or Brethren visiting Sweden has been dismissed as absurd, but appears less unreasonable when the existence of an esoteric tradition beneath Freemasonry is recognized. Certainly, the Sanctuary of Memphis was dedicated to the same sublime work that has activated the mysteries and secret societies of all enlightened nations. Of this, Marconus wrote in his Discourse of Esoteric Masonry, "The statue of Isis, always veiled even to the priest, and the Sphinx crouched at the door of the temple in an attitude of response and silence, were the two emblems of these lost secrets, and this conduct of the entrustees of the mysteries was directed by the highest wisdom. The despotic rule of strong, violent men extended over the whole world. Everywhere the inexorable Wawiktes was the only international and political law. Everywhere heads had to bow or were crushed. It is easily understood from this that the trustees of the primitive knowledge of human grandeur, of its sublime dignity, of its equality before the Creator, of its inalterable liberty, were forced to hide their treasure and to communicate it only to those who were found to be worthy, for before communicating it, they had to be certain that the new candidate did not intend to sell the knowledge to their enemies. Among the Apocrypha of the Rite is one relating to the initiation of Plato into the mysteries of Memphis. It appears in Egypt in the 19th century by M. Ed Dion. According to this graceful fiction, a pilgrim identified with Plato came to the banks of the Nile just before the 95th Olympiad. He sought initiation and underwent trials in dark caverns under the earth. 3 men with helmets, represented the heads of dogs, guarded a door of iron. They warned him of the dangers ahead, but the neophyte pressed on, passing through frightful experiences until he finally came to a room lighted by hundreds of torches, where sat 60 priests, robed in fine linen and wearing the insignia of their ranks. Initiation was followed by a retreat of 81 days, and later there were 6 months of study devoted to the sacred sciences. The initiate then took an oath of silence and was acknowledged as one of the sacred college. From this and similar statements, it is evident that Marconius, like many other Masonic innovators of the period, was convinced that Masonry was in some way the continuation of ancient mystical societies dedicated to the enlargement of the human estate. If he fashioned upon the foundations of the Rite of Mizra, Mackenzie has pointed out that Le Changeur, credited with the rituals of Mizra, merely appropriated his material from the Egyptian mystery of Cagliostro. To press the matter further is to be confronted with other Masonic difficulties. Brother Cagliostro, Esperance Lodge number 289, London, is described by some as heir, through the Jesuits, to information which they had filched from the Rosicrucians. It is all exceedingly complicated, but the essential principles remain unchanged and the formula is repeated so frequently that one may suggest that the presence of so much smoke indicates some fire. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Rosies. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.